Good morning, it's Suze with your daily intention. It's the 5th of June today, and I think it's the 5th of June. Yes, it's the 5th of June. And today's intention, word of intention, is reasonable. And I thought, wow, we could use a little bit of reasonableness now in our world. It is a time for everyone to tap into what's reasonable for them. And here's the thing about what's reasonable is that it's different for each of us. Each and every one of us, it's different. We can't know what's reasonable for someone else. We don't know what's happening for them. You know, I heard a story about a grandmother from Alberta who went to British Columbia to help her daughter, who was frontline, working full time, two little kids under the age of 3, one not even walking yet. Her husband, the husband of the woman, had had shoulder surgery and so was unable to lift his children. And so the grandmother drove from Calgary to this location in British Columbia to support and help. Because she had Alberta license plates on, her car was vandalized. Now, I understand that someone might feel that this was someone just coming to holiday, but we can't judge what's reasonable for other people based on our perceptions. We can only judge, and I'm not saying that it's wrong or right to do things. What I am saying is let's all be reasonable. Rather than judging whether it's wrong or right, let's be reasonable about it. We don't know the story behind someone's decision. And maybe stopping to listen and to hear with a compassionate ear is more reasonable in this time than making quick judgments about things. Reasonable. Each of us has had to call into question what's reasonable for us. Is it reasonable for me to go to the grocery store, as used to be our habit, 2-3 times a week? We deemed that that wasn't reasonable. And so we began going less often and having larger orders. Now, someone else may look at that and go, oh, they're stockpiling. Well, yeah, we were for 2 to 3 weeks because we felt that that was reasonable. Now, I don't want to justify what's reasonable for me or what's reasonable for you. What I do want is to encourage everyone to look at what you're seeing with a how could this be reasonable for that person? Not how could this be reasonable for them? No, but how could this be reasonable? Let's look through the lens of possibility rather than the lens of judgment, rather than assuming that our perspective is the reasonable one. This is a time for all perspectives to be brought out into the open, and then collectively we can determine what is reasonable for our society. I know it's not an easy thing to think about, what's reasonable for our societies, but it starts with what's reasonable in your home, what's reasonable in your life, what's reasonable in your head, and making sure that those reasoned decisions come from a place of kindness, come from a place of possibility. So we can look at reasonable in a whole lot easier way. Like, what is it reasonable for me to accomplish today? Okay, because there's a place that we judge ourselves, isn't it? Yeah, oh, I'm going to get all this done, and then I don't, and then I judge myself. Maybe it wasn't reasonable to start with. I know so many people that were expecting themselves to put in 8 hours of solid work when they're working from home. It's not reasonable. You don't put in 8 hours of solid work when you're at work. You can't do it in an out of work environment. Let's be reasonable with ourselves. It's not reasonable for our kids to do 7 hours of homeschooling a day. It's unreasonable to ask parents to do that. It's unreasonable to ask kids to do that. They don't do 7 hours of straight solid work when they're at school. So let's be reasonable about our expectations for ourselves and our family. Can we do that today? Is that reasonable? You know, in fact, let's just be reasonable about ourselves today. I know I have a huge list, and what I looked at is I went, what's reasonable for today? And I picked two things. One that was reasonable for me to do in my business today, and one that's reasonable for me to do personally today. Everything else then becomes sprinkles or gravy or extra bonuses. Let's look at what's reasonable. The world is under a lot of stress right now. I think it's reasonable to cut each other a pretty wide berth of understanding, of compassion, of kindness. And it starts with each of us, being reasonable with whom? Ourselves. So give yourself permission to be reasonable with your expectations for you. Choose one or two things that's totally reasonable for you to accomplish today and be grateful for that. Try on the lens of possibility. Practice it. What's reasonable? You know, I was at the bank yesterday. First time I've been to the bank in 3 months. And I was lined up and they had somebody at the door greeting, and they were doing such a good job of helping everyone feel welcomed in that kind of awkward position. It was the first time in my life I've ever walked into a bank with a mask on. And it felt really weird. But it was reasonable. Now, it was a pretty mask, it was a happy mask, and my eyes were happy, but it was weird. So what used to be reasonable for us, not as reasonable. Or maybe what didn't used to be reasonable now is. It changes, doesn't it? Yeah, it's what's reasonable. Something to think about today. I look forward to your comments on what you're finding is reasonable for you. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow for Daily Intention.